After 20 years he claimed he needed space and demanded a divorce. I signed without a word. Months later, as he celebrated his engagement to his secretary at our old vacation spot, I arrived unannounced. "Congratulations," I said, handing him an envelope. "His father's will had a clause. Divorce me, lose everything." His fiancée's scream was priceless. "I need space." 3 simple words that shattered 20 years of marriage on a Tuesday evening at Giovanni's, our favorite restaurant. Not, "I'm unhappy," or "we need to talk," but the coward's prelude to abandonment, delivered between the chicken parmesan and tiramisu. Robert didn't even have the decency to meet my eyes when he said it, his attention fixed on the condensation sliding down his water glass, as if it were somehow more deserving of his focus than the woman who had devoted 2 decades of her life to him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real beginning was 3 weeks earlier in a sterile examination room with mint green walls and motivational posters about courage that suddenly felt like mockery. "Mrs. Mitchell, you have stage 2 breast cancer." Dr. Patel's voice was gentle but firm, her eyes kind behind practical glasses. "The good news is we've caught it relatively early. With surgery and radiation, the prognosis is quite favorable. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining Margaret's journey from betrayal to empowerment. If stories of resilience and unexpected strength in the face of life's cruelest surprises speak to you, consider subscribing. It's completely free and connects you with others who understand that sometimes the perfect life is merely an illusion. Now let's witness how 20 years of marriage can shatter in an instant, and how sometimes justice arrives in the most unexpected ways. I remember nodding mechanically, asking all the right questions, scheduling follow-up appointments, going through the motions while feeling strangely detached from my own body. At 48, the word itself felt foreign in my mouth, like a bitter pill I couldn't quite swallow. The timing couldn't have been worse. Robert had been promoted to senior partner at his law firm just months earlier. The new position came with longer hours, more stress, and higher expectations. I'd spent weeks assuring him I could handle everything at home. The endless social obligations, charity functions, dinner parties, all the invisible work that made his success possible. And now this. An inconvenient illness that didn't fit into our carefully curated lives. I rehearsed breaking the news to him on the drive home, planning to approach it calmly, rationally, the way Robert preferred to handle difficult situations. But when I arrived, our house was empty. A text message pinged, "Working late. Don't wait up." The 3rd time that week. I placed my hand over my chest, feeling the hidden enemy within, and wondered when exactly my husband had started pulling away. That night, I sat alone in our kitchen, tracing the veins of the marble countertop we'd selected together during our 10th anniversary renovation. When had our home become a showpiece rather than a sanctuary? When had I become just another carefully chosen accessory in Robert's climb to success? Looking back, the signs had been there for months. Robert's sudden interest in his appearance, new designer suits, a gym membership he actually used, the expensive cologne I didn't recognize. Our conversations grew shorter, his criticisms sharper. The way he checked his phone constantly during our rare dinners together. How he flinched when I touched him. But I'd been too busy maintaining our perfect life to acknowledge what was happening right in front of me. "Margaret, did you reschedule the dinner with the Hendersons?" Robert asked the next morning, not bothering to look up from his phone during our brief overlapping minutes at breakfast. "I thought we could talk about something important first," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can it wait? I have court in an hour and the Jacobson case is a mess." I swallowed the news along with my lukewarm coffee. "Sure. It can wait." But it continued to wait as days stretched into a week, then 2. Robert came home later each night, his excuses increasingly vague. I scheduled my first oncology appointment alone, telling myself I was being strong, independent, not abandoned. In the quiet moments between maintaining appearances and researching treatment options, I began to notice the gaps in our life together. The framed photos throughout our home that captured smiles but not joy. The separate bedrooms we'd been occupying for months under the pretense of his late work hours and my early mornings. Then came the credit card statement with charges from jewelry stores I'd never visited, restaurants too intimate for business meetings. The late-night phone calls he took in the garage, voice lowered. The lipstick shade on his collar that wasn't mine, a vibrant red I'd never had the confidence to wear. "I think we should have a special dinner this weekend," Robert said that Friday, his voice oddly formal. "There's something important we need to discuss." Hope flickered. Perhaps my illness had made him realize what truly mattered. Perhaps we could still salvage what we'd built. I spent hours preparing for that dinner, choosing a dress that hid my recent weight loss, applying makeup to disguise the dark circles beneath my eyes. I even called my sister, breaking my silence about the diagnosis. "He's finally noticed something's wrong," I told her. "Maybe this is what we needed, a wake-up call." "Maggie," she said hesitantly, "have you considered that might not be what he wants to talk about?" I dismissed her concern. 20 years of marriage had to count for something. Giovanni's was quiet that Tuesday evening, the soft lighting creating a false sense of intimacy. Robert seemed nervous, tugging at his collar, checking his watch. Something cold settled in my stomach as I realized he'd chosen a public place for whatever was coming next. "I need space, Margaret," he finally said, cutting me off mid-sentence as I began to tell him about my diagnosis. "This isn't working anymore." The words hung between us like shattered glass. 20 years isn't working? I asked quietly. "I've changed. You've changed. We want different things now." His rehearsed speech continued, full of empty platitudes and corporate-sounding euphemisms. "It would be better for both of us to make a clean break." "Is there someone else?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. His hesitation was answer enough. "Jessica," he admitted finally. "My secretary. It just happened. Just happened." As if 2 decades of marriage could be erased by something that just happened. As if my cancer diagnosis, which I still hadn't managed to share, was less significant than his newfound passion for a woman half my age. "I want a divorce," he concluded, sliding a business card across the table. "My lawyer will be in touch. I've already found an apartment." I stared at the card, at his perfectly manicured fingers, at the expensive watch I'd given him for our 15th anniversary. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. He looked startled, as if he'd expected tears, pleading a scene. "Yes," he said cautiously. "I suppose it is." I nodded once, placed my napkin beside my barely touched meal, and walked out of Giovanni's with my dignity intact and my heart in pieces. The cancer would have to wait. I had a divorce to survive first. The manila envelope arrived exactly 7 days after Giovanni's. Robert's lawyer, not even someone from his own firm, but a divorce specialist with an office in a gleaming downtown tower, had wasted no time. I placed the envelope on my kitchen counter and stared at it for hours before finding the courage to break the seal. Inside lay the cold, clinical dissection of 20 years together. Our house, to be sold, proceeds split, retirement accounts, divided equally, personal property itemized with surgical precision. Robert had even listed the anniversary pearls he'd given me 5 years ago, assigning them a monetary value as if they were just another asset to be divided. The final page required only my signature to dissolve 2 decades of promises. I should have called my own lawyer. I should have fought. But something inside me had shifted that night at Giovanni's, a quiet calculus forming beneath my grief. "Are you sure about this, Maggie?" My sister Claire's voice crackled through the phone line. "He doesn't deserve an easy way out. You should take him for everything he's worth." "I need to focus on my health right now," I replied, not mentioning that I still hadn't told Robert about my diagnosis. Fighting him would just drain energy I don't have. What I didn't tell Claire was that my surrender wasn't defeat, it was strategy. Every instinct told me to wait, to watch, to let Robert believe he'd won. I signed the papers with steady hands, wrote a brief note declining mediation or further discussion, and sent the package back the same day. Then I made 2 phone calls. One to my oncologist to schedule surgery, the other to George Mitchell, my father-in-law. George had always been more parent to me than my own father. After my mother died when I was in college, it was George who stepped in with quiet support and practical guidance. When Robert and I married, George embraced me fully as his daughter. Even as Robert grew increasingly distant over the years, my weekly lunches with George remained a constant. "I was wondering when you'd call," George said when he answered. His voice, still strong at 82, carried a note of resignation. "Robert told me yesterday." "Did he tell you why?" I asked, settling onto my porch swing. A heavy pause. "He gave me some nonsense about growing apart. But I've seen how he looks at that girl from his office." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, connected by our shared disappointment in the man we both loved. "I'd still like to have our lunch on Thursday," I said finally. "If that's okay with you." "Nothing would make me happier, Margaret. Nothing at all." 2 days later, I sat across from George at Mercer's cafe, watching him methodically butter his toast. He looked older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders slightly more stooped. "Robert gets his ruthlessness from his mother," George said suddenly, setting down his knife. "I always hoped your gentleness would soften those edges." "I think I enabled them instead," I admitted. George reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I need to tell you something, Margaret. Something important." He explained that after his wife died 6 years ago, he'd made changes to his will. Robert was his only child, set to inherit the family business, the lake house in Vermont, and a substantial estate. "But I added a condition," George said, his eyes never leaving mine. "A moral clause, my lawyer called it." I listened, stunned, as George revealed the provision. Robert would forfeit his entire inheritance if he ever divorced me without clear evidence of infidelity on my part. The divorce had to be initiated by me, or by him with documented proof of my misconduct. "Why would you do that?" I whispered. "Because I watched how he treated you even then. How he took your devotion for granted." George's voice grew fierce. "And because I've seen too many men in my generation discard loyal wives once they've served their purpose." I sat back, processing this revelation. "Does Robert know about this clause?" "He never bothered to read the will," George said with a sad smile. "Too busy climbing the ladder to concern himself with an old man's affairs." That lunch changed everything. Walking home, I felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. For the first time, I saw Robert's hasty divorce as what it truly was: a miscalculation. The weeks that followed brought unexpected clarity. While recovering from my lumpectomy, a procedure Robert knew nothing about, I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage. I hired a financial advisor to help secure my future. I began radiation treatments with Claire by my side, discovering reserves of strength I never knew I possessed. Then came the Instagram post that ripped open barely healed wounds. Robert's new assistant had tagged him at L'Artiste, an exclusive restaurant known for its romantic ambience. The caption, "She said yes," floated above the image of Jessica's manicured hand sporting a diamond ring that looked suspiciously like the one in my grandmother's jewelry box, the one Robert had always dismissed as outdated. The comments section overflowed with congratulations, including several from couples we'd entertained in our home. The engagement had come mere weeks after our divorce was finalized. The speed of it was both insulting and revealing. That night, I scrolled through Jessica's public profile, piecing together a timeline of their relationship through seemingly innocent photos. Office parties where they stood too close, team dinners where Robert's law partners were conspicuously absent. Their affair had begun long before Robert's request for space. I was about to close the app when I spotted it. A photo of Lakeview Cottage, George's beloved vacation home in Vermont. The caption made my blood run cold. "Planning our perfect engagement party. #justice, #fresh start, #Lakeview memories." The very place where Robert had proposed to me 21 years ago. The property that, according to George's will, would never be his if he divorced me. I set down my phone and walked to the window, watching darkness settle over the neighborhood where I'd spent half my life. The quiet strife I'd been nurturing crystallized into something more defined: purpose. Robert thought he'd walked away with his freedom and his future secured. He had no idea that his father had foreseen this very scenario, or that I now held the power to upend his carefully constructed new life. I picked up my phone and opened my calendar. The engagement party was in 3 weeks. Just enough time to plan my appearance at Lakeview Cottage and deliver the news that would shatter Robert's perfect illusion, just as he had shattered mine. 3 weeks wasn't much time to prepare for the confrontation that would change everything. My radiation treatments left me exhausted, but each session felt like another step toward reclaiming my body from both cancer and the shadow of my failed marriage. The technicians became unexpected confidants, their cheerful, "3 more to go, Mrs. Mitchell," counting down not just to the end of treatment but to my reinvention. "You don't have to keep using his name, you know," Claire pointed out one afternoon as she drove me home from the hospital. "You were Margaret Jenkins for 28 years before you became Margaret Mitchell." The thought struck me with unexpected force. I'd been so focused on what Robert had taken that I'd forgotten what I could reclaim. Jenkins, I said softly, testing the sound of my maiden name. Margaret Jenkins. The next day, I visited the courthouse and filled out the paperwork to restore my former surname. The clerk handling my case, a woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, studied me over her reading glasses. Divorce? She asked bluntly. Recently, I admitted. She nodded, stamping my form with unnecessary force. I processed mine 30 years ago. Best decision I ever made. She slid the paperwork back to me with a conspirator's smile. Welcome back to yourself, Ms. Jenkins. That small act of reclamation sparked others. I called my old law firm, the one I'd left when Robert's career demanded we relocate, and arranged coffee with my former mentor, Judith Abernathy. At 75, Judith had broken countless glass ceilings and showed no signs of slowing down. So he left you for his secretary? How breathtakingly original, she snorted when I explained my situation. The familiar sharpness of her wit was oddly comforting. And what's your plan now, Maggie? Besides making him regret the day he met you? I hesitated, then shared everything. The cancer, George's will, the engagement party at Lakeview Cottage. Judith listened without interruption, her eyes narrowing strategically. You need documentation, she said when I finished. The will clause is powerful, but only if you can prove it exists and that George was of sound mind when he added it. George gave me a copy, I said, but I haven't told Robert about it yet. And you won't, Judith declared, pulling out her phone. Not until the moment of maximum impact. She made a quick call, then smiled at me. My estate law colleague will meet us at my office in 20 minutes. We're going to make sure this is airtight. As my circle of allies grew, so did my strength. My oncologist declared my prognosis excellent after my final radiation treatment. My financial advisor helped me secure my own apartment and investment strategy. Even my neighbor Michael, a quiet widower who had always been more Robert's friend than mine, stopped by with homemade soup and an unexpected offer. I overheard Robert at the club last week, he said, eyes fixed on his coffee cup. He was telling everyone you'd had emotional problems for years and he'd finally had to end things for his own well-being. Michael looked up, his expression troubled. I know that's not true. If you need someone to set the record straight, I'm happy to speak up. The revision of our shared history wasn't surprising. Robert had always controlled the narrative, but the casual cruelty of it stung. He wasn't content with leaving. He needed to destroy what we'd had, to justify his actions to himself and others. Thank you, Michael, I said, genuinely touched. Just knowing you saw through it means a lot. With 2 weeks until the engagement party, I focused on the practical aspects of my plan. Judith arranged for a court-certified copy of George's will to be prepared, complete with notarized authentication. Claire helped me select an outfit that would command attention without seeming desperate. A slate blue dress that complemented my newly silver-streaked hair, which I'd stopped coloring during treatment. You look powerful, she said as I tried it on. Like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. I was beginning to feel that way too. The most difficult preparation was emotional. Each night, I visualized the confrontation. Robert's shock, Jessica's confusion, the moment of revelation. I rehearsed my words, perfecting the precise tone of calculated indifference. Not angry, not bitter, just matter of fact. A business transaction, nothing more. 1 week before the event, a final piece fell into place when George called me, his voice urgent. Robert just phoned to invite me to the engagement party, he said. I told him I wasn't feeling well enough to travel. You don't want to be there? Asked, surprised. Oh, I absolutely want to be there, George chuckled. But not until after you've delivered the news. I'll arrive the following morning to help clean up the mess. And Margaret? I've instructed my lawyer to send the official inheritance notification letter to arrive at Lakeview the morning after the party. Timing is everything. The day before I was set to leave for Vermont, I discovered through social media that Robert had been busy rewriting more than our history. Jessica had posted photos of Lakeview Cottage's interior, now stripped of the warm antiques and family photographs I'd carefully curated over 2 decades. In their place were sleek, modern pieces, all evidence of the Mitchell family heritage carefully erased, replaced with the sterile aesthetic of a luxury rental. Creating our dream space. New beginnings, the caption read. The cottage had been my refuge whenever Robert's work consumed him. I'd spent countless weekends there, befriending the local shopkeepers, tending the heirloom garden George's mother had planted. Now it was being transformed into a showcase for Robert's new life, with no acknowledgement of what came before. As I packed my overnight bag and placed the sealed envelope containing the will excerpt in my purse, I realized I no longer felt like a victim seeking justice. This wasn't about revenge, it was about consequences. Robert had discarded our vows, their meaning, and me. He'd never imagined I might rise from those ashes transformed. I checked my flight confirmation one last time and closed my laptop. Tomorrow, Robert would learn that some promises couldn't be broken without a cost, and I would be there to witness the reckoning. The Vermont countryside unfurled before me as I navigated the rental car along familiar winding roads. Each curve brought a memory. Robert and I driving up for our first anniversary, George teaching us the names of local wildflowers, the autumn we'd spent repainting the cottage's shutters that perfect shade of forest green. Now those shutters were stark white, visible from the road as I approached the final turn. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. I pulled over, needing a moment to compose myself. Through the trees I could glimpse Lakeview's distinctive sloped roof, hear faint music and laughter drifting across the lake. The celebration was clearly underway. "You can do this," I whispered to my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the one who had signed divorce papers with quiet resignation just months ago. My hair was styled in a confident bob that showcased the silver strands I'd once hidden. The shadows beneath my eyes had faded. Even my posture had changed, no longer curved inward protectively but straight and resolute. I checked my phone. 4:42 p.m. The party had started at 3. Perfect timing, late enough that everyone would be present, early enough that they'd still be sober and alert. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the long driveway, now lined with expensive cars I recognized from Robert's firm. Near the cottage itself, white paper lanterns hung from tree branches, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. A photographer was directing a group shot on the dock. All tailored suits and flowing dresses, champagne flutes held aloft. No one noticed me at first. I parked alongside the other vehicles and sat for a moment, hand resting on the envelope in my purse. My heartbeat steadied. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about justice. I stepped from the car and smoothed my dress. The slate blue fabric caught the late afternoon sun as I made my way toward the cottage, following the sound of a string quartet playing near the lake. The back garden had been transformed with white chairs and tables adorned with arrangements of calla lilies, Jessica's favorite, according to her Instagram. A bartender mixed cocktails beneath a white tent. Catering staff circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres. I recognized most of the guests, colleagues from Robert's firm, country club acquaintances, some of our former neighbors. A few glanced my way, their expressions shifting from confusion to discomfort as they recognized me. One woman, Diane Harris, whose husband had made partner the same year as Robert, actually gasped, her champagne sloshing over the rim of her glass. "Margaret? Is that you?" she stammered. I smiled pleasantly. "Lovely to see you, Diane. Beautiful party, isn't it?" Before she could respond, I continued toward the center of the gathering, where Robert stood with his arm around Jessica's waist, holding court with the senior partners from his firm. His back was to me, but I would have known his stance anywhere. That particular tilt of his head when he was trying to impress someone, the slight lean into his right hip. Jessica saw me first. Her smile faltered, eyes widening in recognition and alarm. She tugged at Robert's sleeve, whispering urgently. He turned, his expression transitioning from annoyance to shock to a carefully composed mask of civility. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Robert," I replied, my tone light and conversational. "Jessica, congratulations on your engagement." A tense silence descended. The string quartet faltered briefly before continuing their melody. Nearby conversations halted as guests turned to witness the unfolding drama. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Robert suggested, already moving to guide me away from the crowd, away from his embarrassment. "Oh, I won't stay long," I assured him. "I just wanted to deliver this in person." I removed the envelope from my purse and held it out. Robert didn't take it. His eyes darted around the gathering, calculating the damage to his reputation. Jessica stepped closer, her hand possessively gripping his arm. "What is it?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. "Just a copy of something Robert should have read years ago," I explained. "Your future father-in-law's will. Specifically, the moral clause regarding divorce." Robert's face paled. "What are you talking about?" I opened the envelope and extracted the notarized document, holding it where both could see the official seal. "George added this provision 6 years ago. It states quite clearly that if you initiated divorce proceedings against me without evidence of infidelity on my part, you would forfeit your entire inheritance." Jessica snatched the document, scanning it frantically. Her perfectly manicured nails crumpled the edges as she read. "This can't be legal," she insisted, looking up at Robert. "Tell her it's not legal." But Robert stood frozen, finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. "My father would never do this to me," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He did it because he saw who you really were," I replied quietly. "Long before I did." The crowd had grown silent, necks craning to observe our exchange. I noticed Robert's managing partner frowning nearby, no doubt calculating the professional implications. "Everything," I continued, my voice carrying in the stillness. "The firm shares your father held. This cottage. The investment accounts. All of it reverts to George's chosen charity." I paused, allowing the words to sink in. "Unless, of course, you can prove I was unfaithful." Jessica's face contorted with fury. "You planned this," she hissed. "You manipulated an old man to ruin us." I shook my head. "George made this decision years before you entered the picture, Jessica. I only learned about it after Robert left." One of the senior partners approached, his expression severe. "Is this true, Mitchell? Your firm shares aren't secure." Robert's composure cracked. "It's a misunderstanding," he insisted, reaching for the document. "There must be a loophole, an exception. The official notification from George's attorney will arrive tomorrow morning," I said, retrieving the paper from Jessica's trembling hands. "I just thought you deserved some warning." I glanced at the shocked faces surrounding us. "And I wanted to congratulate you both in person, of course." Jessica stared at me, then at Robert, the implications sinking in. Her dream life, the prestigious law partner husband, the vacation home, the secure future, was crumbling before her eyes. Her scream pierced the afternoon air, a sound of pure rage and disbelief that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. "You said everything was taken care of," she shrieked at Robert. "You promised me." I turned to leave, my part in this drama complete. As I walked back toward my car, I heard the growing chaos behind me. Jessica's continued shouting, guests murmuring in shock, Robert's increasingly desperate attempts to control the situation. I didn't look back. The weight I'd carried for months had lifted, replaced by something unexpected: pity. Robert would lose everything he valued. His reputation, his inheritance, possibly even his partnership if the firm found his financial instability too great a liability. Behind the wheel of my rental car, I took one last look at Lakeview Cottage through the rearview mirror. The string quartet had stopped playing. The white lanterns swayed emptily in the breeze. The perfect engagement party had become something entirely different. I started the engine and pulled away, leaving Robert to face the consequences of his choices, just as I had faced mine. The inn by the lake was quiet that evening, my room overlooking the same water that bordered Lakeview Cottage. I ordered room service and sat by the window, watching darkness settle over the mountains. My phone buzzed incessantly, notifications from mutual friends, text messages from Claire asking for updates, even 2 missed calls from George. I silenced it all, needing space to process what had just happened. I'd imagined this moment for weeks, rehearsed it in my mind, prepared for every scenario except how I would feel afterward. The triumph I'd expected hadn't materialized. Instead, I felt hollow, as if I'd shed something essential along with my anger. Sleep came fitfully, but I woke at dawn feeling oddly refreshed. Over breakfast in the inn's solarium, I finally checked my messages. The news had spread like wildfire through our social circle, each retelling more dramatic than the last. According to Claire, who'd heard from our neighbor Michael, Jessica had thrown her engagement ring into the lake before storming off with her bridesmaids. Robert had gotten spectacularly drunk after most guests departed, ranting about betrayal to anyone still listening. George's voicemail was more measured. I've arrived at the cottage. Robert's here looking quite devastated. My lawyer delivered the official notice an hour ago. Call me when you can. I took my time driving back to Boston, stopping at viewpoints along the way, breathing mountain air that tasted of possibility. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of the city that my phone rang again, Robert's name flashing on the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something told me this conversation needed to happen. Margaret, his voice sounded rough, unfamiliar. We need to talk. I'm listening, I said, pulling into a rest area. Not over the phone. In person. He paused. Please. We met the following evening at a small cafe halfway between his apartment and mine. Robert arrived first, securing a corner table away from other patrons. He looked haggard, his crisp appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and 3 days' stubble. When he saw me, he stood awkwardly as if unsure whether to offer a handshake or hug. Thank you for coming, he said as I took my seat. What did you want to discuss? I kept my tone neutral, not unkind but not inviting either. Jessica left. He stared into his untouched coffee. The firm has asked me to take a leave of absence while they assess the situation. Dad's refusing my calls. His eyes met mine. You've destroyed everything. You did that yourself, Robert. The waitress approached, looked between us, sensed the tension and retreated without taking my order. Why didn't you tell me about the clause? He demanded, leaning forward. All those weeks during the divorce proceedings. You knew and said nothing. Would it have changed anything? Would you have stayed? His silence answered for him. I didn't orchestrate this to hurt you, I said carefully. I just refused to protect you from the consequences of your choices. And now you get the satisfaction of watching me lose everything. I don't get anything, Robert. The inheritance goes to charity, not to me. I studied him, this man I'd spent half my life with. But I did get something else, the chance to stand up for myself. Which brings me to the reason I agreed to meet. I took a deep breath. I have cancer. His face went blank with shock. What? Stage 2 breast cancer. I found out 3 weeks before you asked for the divorce. I tried to tell you that night at Giovanni's, but you were too busy explaining how you needed space. Robert paled. Margaret, I had no idea. I know, I interrupted. And I'm telling you now not to make you feel guilty, but because I'm done keeping secrets. I'm in remission, by the way. The prognosis is excellent. He stared at me, genuinely speechless for perhaps the first time in 20 years. I spent decades being Robert Mitchell's wife, I continued. Arranging my life around your career, your needs. When you left, I thought I'd lost everything. But I was wrong. I smiled slightly. I found myself instead. 2 days later, the law firm's official statement hit the local business news. Robert had chosen to resign to pursue other opportunities. His managing partner, a man who'd dined at our table countless times, wasted no time distancing the firm from the scandal. Friends who'd sided with Robert after the divorce suddenly remembered long-standing coffee dates with me. The ripples spread outward, reshaping social alliances like tectonic shifts. I watched it all with remarkable detachment. My focus had turned inward, toward rebuilding rather than reaction. Spring arrived, bringing an unexpected job offer from Judith's firm. A position managing their nonprofit clients, utilizing the fundraising skills I'd honed through years of charity work for Robert's business connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those events I'd organized as his wife becoming legitimate professional experience. They're not hiring you as a favor to me, Judith insisted when I expressed doubt. They're hiring you because you're good at this. You always were. 6 months after the confrontation at Lakeview Cottage, I received a letter from George. He'd decided to sell the cottage, too painful now with its mixed memories. Enclosed was a small key. The garden shed still holds your grandmother's antique gardening tools, he wrote. I thought you might want them. They should belong to someone who appreciates growing things. I drove up the following weekend, half expecting to find Robert there, but the cottage stood empty. The new white shutters had already begun to peel in the harsh mountain weather. Inside the garden shed, I found not only my grandmother's tools but a stack of photo albums I'd assembled over the years. Family holidays, milestones, quiet moments, all carefully preserved by George. As I packed them into my car, a familiar vehicle pulled into the driveway. Robert stepped out, looking healthier than he had at the cafe, though noticeably less polished in jeans and a simple sweater. "Dad said you'd be here," he explained. "I wanted to return something." He handed me a small velvet box containing my mother's earrings, ones I'd thought lost in the divorce settlement. "I should have given these back months ago," he said. "I was too angry then. And now?" He looked toward the lake, then back at me. "Now I'm just trying to rebuild one day at a time. New job at a smaller firm in Providence. Smaller apartment. Smaller life." He offered a rueful smile. "It's not what I planned, but maybe it's what I needed." We walked to the dock together, sitting side by side as we had countless times before, watching the afternoon light play across the water. "You know what's strange?" I said finally. "I don't regret any of it anymore. Not even the end." Robert nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand that." As the sun began to set, we said goodbye, not as enemies or even as former spouses, but as two people acknowledging both what was lost and what was found in the breaking. I drove away from Lakeview Cottage for the final time, the photo albums beside me, the road ahead clear and open. At my birthday party, my mother-in-law whispered something in my husband's ear, and I saw the shift in his eyes before I could react. The next moment, his slap sent me crashing to the floor. Stunned, I lay there as he turned to walk away, until a slow chuckle escaped my lips. He froze. His face drained of color. The email glowed on my screen like a confession. The Harrington Trust disbursement requires continuous marital status of no less than 5 years with no separation filings. My hand trembled as I forwarded it to my encrypted server, the final piece slotting into place. Behind me, the gray Boston dawn filtered through designer curtains James had insisted on, curtains that cost more than my first car. I slammed my laptop shut as the bathroom door opened. Steam billowed out as James emerged, towel wrapped around his waist, his body still magnificent at 37. His eyes, however, held that increasingly vacant look I'd been documenting for months. "Happy birthday, Elise," he said, the words rehearsed hollow. He bent to kiss my cheek, his lips cool despite the hot shower. "Mother's excited about tonight. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in." "I'm sure she is," I thought, but replied with practiced warmth. It was so generous of Victoria to arrange everything. My voice, the one I'd perfected in courtrooms to sway juries, didn't betray the ice forming inside my chest. "What are you working on?" he asked, glancing at my closed laptop. "Just reviewing the Westbrook merger documents," I lied smoothly. "Even birthday girls don't get days off at Caldwell and Pierce." He nodded, accepting this without question. When we'd first met 6 years ago, he would have teased me about my workaholic tendencies, maybe tried to coax me back to bed. That James was gone now, replaced by this polished automaton who responded to his family's signals like a trained animal. As he dressed for his morning at the family office, I retreated to my walk-in closet, the one place in our Beacon Hill brownstone without cameras. Victoria had installed the surveillance system last year during our renovation. A thoughtful security measure for her beloved son and daughter-in-law. Only I knew about the tiny devices I'd discovered during a methodical search 3 months ago. Only I knew that I'd left them functional but fed them a loop of routine activity whenever I needed privacy. Inside the closet, I pressed my fingertip against a nearly invisible seam in the wall. A panel slid open, revealing a water-resistant case containing hard drives, a backup laptop and 3 burner phones. My insurance policy. My weapon. For 4 years, I'd been the picture-perfect addition to the Harrington dynasty. Harvard law graduate, rising star at Boston's most prestigious corporate law firm, charitable foundation board member, and devoted wife to James Harrington, heir to one of New England's oldest fortunes. The society pages loved us. Victoria paraded me at every function like a prize thoroughbred. No one suspected that behind my carefully applied makeup and designer clothes, I was building a case that would bring the Harrington empire crashing down. It started with discrepancies I noticed while helping James review some family business documents. Numbers that didn't add up. Subsidiaries in countries with questionable banking laws. Then came the strange meetings James would return from with altered behavior. More withdrawn, less decisive. The way Victoria would whisper things in his ear at family gatherings that would change his demeanor instantly. I'd spent 3 years defending corporations against fraud allegations. I knew what financial manipulation looked like. I knew what psychological control looked like too. The day I found James staring catatonically at a video sent by his cousin William was the day I began my secret investigation in earnest. That night I purchased the first burner phone. From my hidden cache, I extracted a microSD card and inserted it into my secure phone. The encrypted files contained everything: bank transfers to offshore accounts, recordings of family meetings where they spoke openly about conditioning certain responses in James, evidence of market manipulation and bribes to federal officials. My fingers scrolled to the newest file: photographs taken yesterday of Thomas Whitley, James' supposed childhood therapist, meeting with Victoria at her Back Bay home. The same man referenced in documents as behavioral consultant, and paid $30,000 monthly from a Harrington shell company. I checked my watch, 7:15 a.m. Nearly time to become Elise Harrington again. I replaced everything, sealed the compartment, and selected a conservative St. John suit for court that morning. The Prescott hearing would finish by noon, giving me time to change for my birthday celebration at Victoria's favorite harborside restaurant. As I applied my makeup, I practiced my expressions in the mirror: delighted surprise, gracious appreciation, devoted affection. The same expressions I'd worn for years while collecting evidence against the people who had hollowed out my husband and built a criminal enterprise behind a philanthropic facade. James appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a custom suit, hair perfectly styled. Once seeing him like this would have quickened my pulse. Now I catalogued the changes in him: the slightly diminished pupils, the microscopic delay before emotional responses, the new tension in his jaw. "You look beautiful," he said mechanically. "Thank you, darling." I stood and straightened his already perfect tie, studying his eyes for any flicker of the man I'd married. "Nothing. I'll see you tonight. Don't let your mother go overboard with the surprises." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "She just wants everything perfect for you." Perfect. The Harringtons' favorite word. Their perfect family. Perfect business. Perfect control. As I gathered my briefcase and court materials, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Wear the blue Valentino tonight. James loves you in that color." Another command disguised as motherly advice. I texted back a grateful response, then selected the crimson Dior I'd been saving for a special occasion. Small rebellions kept me sane while I assembled my case. In the Uber to the courthouse, I reviewed my actual casework, compartmentalizing as I'd learned to do. By day I was still Elise Harrington, corporate defense attorney. My clients relied on me, and ironically, the skills that made me effective in their defense had made me devastating in building my case against the Harringtons. At the courthouse steps I checked my secure messaging app. My contact at the SEC had confirmed receipt of my latest intelligence. "Moving on this next week," he'd written. "Need anything more from your source?" I smiled as I typed back, "One final piece coming tonight." Little did Victoria know that her elaborate birthday trap for me would instead become the Harringtons' unmasking. Tonight, at my birthday celebration surrounded by Boston's elite and the family's closest allies, everything would change. I tucked my phone away and ascended the courthouse steps, my expression serene, my posture confident. Inside I was counting down the hours. The perfect facade was about to shatter. And I would be there, camera phone in hand, to capture every damning moment. The Hestia Gardens shimmered like a mirage at the edge of Boston Harbor, its glass and steel architecture catching the sunset in hues of gold and crimson. Fitting, I thought, for what promised to be a bloodletting disguised as a celebration. The restaurant had a 3-month waiting list, but the Harrington name had secured not just a reservation but the entire rooftop terrace. "Mrs. Harrington, welcome," the maitre d' practically bowed as our town car arrived. "Mrs. Victoria has been asking about you." "I'm sure she has," I murmured, accepting James's mechanical arm. He'd been silent during our ride, checking his watch every few minutes as if timing his performance. The elevator ascended smoothly to the rooftop, and I used those moments to center myself. My crimson Dior hugged my body like armor, the color a silent declaration of war against Victoria's blue Valentino directive. James hadn't even noticed my defiance, another sign of his detachment. The doors opened to a carefully orchestrated tableau. Crystal chandeliers suspended from invisible wires created the illusion of stars floating above the harbor view. White orchids, Victoria's signature, adorned every surface. And positioned strategically throughout the space were approximately 50 guests, all smiling with the practiced warmth of predators. Happy birthday. The collective greeting washed over me as artificial as the orchid's perfume. Victoria glided forward, resplendent in midnight blue Chanel, her silver bob gleaming under the chandeliers. At 62 she remained striking, the grande dame of Boston society, whose ruthlessness was exceeded only by her skill at concealing it. Darling Elise, she embraced me, her Hermès perfume enveloping me like chloroform. Her lips brushed my cheek as she whispered, "Blue would have complemented James better for the photographs." "I wanted to surprise everyone," I replied, matching her steel-lined warmth. "Even on my birthday." Her eyes flashed, the first authentic response I'd seen from her in months. She recovered instantly, linking her arm through mine to parade me through my celebration. "Everyone important is here," she announced, leading me past Boston's elite. The police commissioner, 2 state senators, a federal judge, 3 university presidents. I noted each face, mentally checking them against my files of Harrington connections. Not one of my law partners was present. Not my closest friend from Harvard. Not my mentor from my first firm. The guest list had been sanitized of anyone with genuine connection to me. Anyone who might notice if something were to happen to the real Elise beneath the Harrington veneer. Champagne birthday girl? William Harrington, James's cousin and the family's legal fixer, appeared at my elbow with 2 flutes. "Thank you, Will," I accepted, not drinking. "Lovely to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, his Harvard-educated drawl stretched thin over something urgent. His eyes darted to the entrance, where I noticed a silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit being escorted in. "Excuse me a moment." I watched Will intercept the newcomer, Thomas Whitley, the childhood therapist, whose practices had apparently extended well beyond conventional treatment. The man who received monthly payments categorized as behavioral maintenance in the Harringtons' private ledgers. A server with canapés provided perfect cover to drift closer to their conversation. "Timeline requires acceleration," Will was saying, his back to the party. "The trustees won't extend again. Pushing the protocol risks instability," Whitley replied, his clinical tone unmistakable even in hushed conversation. "The conditioning requires." "We don't have that luxury anymore," Will cut in. "The contractual obligations are clear. If he's not fully controlled by the disbursement date." They noticed my proximity and pivoted smoothly to greetings. Whitley's handshake was brief, his eyes assessing me with clinical detachment. "Mrs. Harrington, happy birthday," he said. "You look radiant." "Thank you, Dr. Whitley. James mentioned you might attend," I lied. "It's been, 15 years since you worked with him?" His smile tightened. "On and off. The Harringtons are more like family than clients." "How fortunate for everyone," I replied, noting the slight dilation of his pupils. He was nervous. Good. Throughout the next hour I circulated carefully, playing my role while observing the room's dynamics. Victoria remained at the epicenter, her laughter theatrical, her eyes constantly tracking me. Whenever James approached me, her attention intensified as if monitoring a laboratory experiment. James himself moved through the party like a sleepwalker, responding to guests with programmed pleasantries. Twice I caught Whitley watching our interactions, making subtle notes on his phone. "Wonderful turnout," remarked Judge Holloway, one of the Harringtons' longest allies. "Victoria certainly knows how to celebrate family." "Indeed," I agreed. "Though I'm surprised my law colleagues couldn't make it." "Exclusive guest list," he chuckled. Victoria was quite specific about keeping this intimate. By intimate, he meant controlled. Vulnerability prickled at the back of my neck. This celebration was hermetically sealed. Anyone here would side with the Harringtons if something happened to me. The party shifted to dinner, Victoria orchestrating the seating with tactical precision. James to my right, her at the head of the table, Whitley positioned directly across from me, his gaze clinically assessing every interaction between James and me. Victoria tapped her crystal glass, silencing conversation. "Before we dine, a toast to my beloved daughter-in-law." She stood, commanding the room with practiced authority. 5 years ago, James brought home this brilliant, beautiful attorney, and I knew immediately she was special. Her eyes met mine, warm on the surface, glacial beneath. Elise has become everything the Harrington family values: loyal, discreet, and committed to our legacy. The gathering murmured approval. I maintained my grateful smile while translating her actual message. We own you. To Elise, Victoria raised her glass. May this 35th year be transformative. The word hung in the air like a promise, or a threat. As servers presented the first course, Victoria glided behind my chair, resting manicured hands on my shoulders. To onlookers, a maternal gesture. I felt the predatory pressure of her grip. Such a perfect evening, she murmured, her voice carrying just to my ears. And after dinner, a very special announcement about the family's future. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on my shoulder before she moved away, leaving behind the lingering scent of her perfume and the distinct impression of a trap about to spring. I glanced at James, finding his eyes fixed on his water glass, fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern I'd documented in my notes. A behavior that always followed Victoria's private conversations with him. Whatever they had planned for tonight was accelerating. The gift presentation would come after the main course. Victoria's chosen moment for whatever announcement she had orchestrated. I touched the slim phone in my clutch, confirming it was ready to record. The federal agents I'd been working with were on standby, waiting for my signal. The first course arrived, oysters arranged in a perfect circle. Victoria beamed at me from the head of the table, raising her glass in another silent toast. I smiled back, lifting my untouched champagne. Let the games begin. The main course plates were cleared away, leaving behind an expectant hush. Victoria nodded to the waitstaff, who began arranging an elaborate display of wrapped gifts on a marble-top table wheeled to the center of the terrace. All part of the spectacle. Gifts I suspected were as empty as the smiles surrounding me. Before dessert, Victoria announced, commanding the room with practiced ease, we must honor our birthday girl properly. The guests arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle, smartphones appearing in manicured hands. In prior years, I might have felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. Tonight I welcomed every camera. James guided me to the gift table with a hand pressed firmly against the small of my back. His touch, once warm and reassuring, now felt mechanical. A practice gesture rather than an intimate connection. Start with this one, Victoria instructed, handing me a small box wrapped in signature Tiffany blue. A collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the gathering. I accepted it with a practiced smile, unwrapping it deliberately. Inside, nestled on white satin, lay a platinum bracelet studded with diamonds. A beautiful handcuff. It's lovely, I said, holding it up for the requisite photographs. James, help your wife put it on, Victoria directed. As he fastened it around my wrist, I felt the weight of it. Another link in their chain. The performance continued through several more gifts. All expensive, all selected to reinforce my position as a Harrington possession rather than an individual. A designer handbag. A weekend at their Martha's Vineyard estate. A donation in my name to the Harrington Foundation. And now, Victoria's voice softened dramatically, for our special announcement. She glided forward, her movement so precisely timed it might have been choreographed. The scent of her Hermès perfume arrived a moment before she did, wrapping around me like an invisible constrictor. The room stilled, all eyes focused on our tableau, Victoria, James, and me, arranged like figures on a chessboard. Her hand rested on James's shoulder, fingers digging in slightly at precise pressure points I'd documented in my research on physical triggers. Elise has been such a treasure to our family, Victoria began, her voice honeyed with false warmth. Devoted, supportive, the perfect partner for James during these 5 critical years of his career. 5 years. The exact duration specified in the trust disbursement conditions. Victoria's eyes gleamed as she leaned closer to James, her lips nearly touching his ear. I activated the recording function on my phone with a discreet movement. Remember your duty, she whispered, though in the hushed room the words carried. Protect what's ours. I watched it happen in slow motion. James's pupils constricted to pinpoints. His jaw slackened momentarily before tightening into a rigid line. The slight tremor in his left hand stilled completely. Then came the words, delivered in a flat tone I'd never heard from him before. You've betrayed us. The room held its collective breath. Victoria stepped back, satisfaction glinting in her eyes as she watched her creation perform. "What do you mean, James?" I asked, my voice steady despite the electric anticipation coursing through me. "We know about the investigation," he continued, each word measured, programmed. "About the files. The contacts with the SEC." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Exactly as I'd anticipated, Victoria wanted witnesses to my alleged betrayal, creating a narrative before the federal case could break. What I hadn't fully anticipated was what came next. James's arm moved with shocking speed. The sound of the slap echoed across the terrace like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence. The impact knocked me sideways against the marble table. I tasted copper as my lips split. The cool floor pressed against my cheek as I lay there, feeling the sting bloom across my face. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Boston's elite stood frozen, witnessing a fracture in the perfect Harrington facade. Then, as Victoria moved to speak, to spin this into another narrative, poor James, pushed to the brink by his treacherous wife, something unexpected happened. I laughed. It started small, a bubble of sound that escaped my bloodied lips. Then it grew, resonating across the stunned gathering. I pushed myself up, crimson Dior smeared with blood, and continued laughing, clear, genuine laughter that cut through the manufactured atmosphere like a blade. "Perfect timing, Victoria," I said, my voice carrying across the silent terrace. Every smartphone still raised, still recording. "You couldn't have scripted it better if you tried." Confusion clouded her perfectly composed features. This wasn't in her scenario. The disgraced wife was supposed to cower, to plead, perhaps to threaten weakly before being escorted out. "James," she snapped, "help your wife up. She's clearly unwell." But James stood motionless, horror dawning in his eyes as the programming fractured. He stared at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. "What did I just?" he whispered, the vacant look receding. "Elise." I rose without assistance, dabbing at my split lip with a white linen napkin. The bright blood bloomed across it like a Japanese watercolor. "You should check your phones," I addressed the gathering calmly. "You've all just witnessed and recorded a perfect demonstration of the Harrington conditioning program. The same program documented in the files I've spent years collecting." I turned to face Victoria directly, savoring the moment her composure began to crack. 5 years, Victoria. That was the requirement for James to access his grandfather's trust. A stable marriage for 5 years. I smiled, tasting blood. "But assault in front of witnesses tends to complicate divorce proceedings, doesn't it?" Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by something I'd never seen there before: fear. "You did this deliberately," she hissed. "You provoked us." "I didn't have to," I replied. "You've been conditioning James for years. All I had to do was wait and document." I gestured to the crowd of shocked faces and raised phones. "And now so has everyone else." The puzzle pieces I'd assembled over years. The financial fraud, the psychological manipulation, the carefully orchestrated control of James, had just been validated by their own actions, in front of the very power structure they'd cultivated. "My phone is sending interesting data packages to several agencies right now," I continued conversationally, "including evidence of how Thomas Whitley here helped condition James to respond to specific triggers." I nodded toward the therapist, who had gone deathly pale. "The physical response programming was particularly effective, wouldn't you say, Doctor?" The first chime of a news alert sounded from someone's phone. Then another. And another. My deadman switch had activated the moment the GPS in my phone registered an impact consistent with physical assault, sending my complete evidence package to the authorities and select media outlets. Victoria's empire wasn't just cracking, it was imploding in real time, in front of the very society she'd manipulated for decades. And as I stood there, blood on my lips and triumph in my heart, I knew there was no going back. "You can't possibly," Victoria began, but froze as her phone chimed with the same news alert now rippling through the gathering. James stood paralyzed, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else, the horror of his action visibly dawning on him. His programming was breaking down, cracks appearing in the facade that had been constructed around his true self. "Elise, I didn't mean to, I don't know why I..." His voice cracked, genuine emotion breaking through the conditioning. "I know you didn't," I said softly, addressing him directly for the first time in months. "That's exactly my point. I turned to face the stunned audience, these powerful people who had been the Harringtons' shield and sword for decades. The blood on my lip gave me a strange authority, the power of undeniable truth. For those checking your phones, yes, that alert is about the Harrington family, I confirmed, my courtroom voice carrying clearly across the terrace. What you've just witnessed is the culmination of a 5-year investigation into one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in Boston. Judge Holloway's face had gone ashen. Senator Prescott was already backing toward the exit. I locked eyes with each of them, ensuring they understood their complicity was also documented. The Harrington Foundation has laundered approximately $340 million through its charitable programs, I continued, diverting funds intended for education initiatives into offshore accounts controlled by shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. Victoria's composure was unraveling visibly now, her perfectly manicured hand clutching at her throat where a pulse hammered beneath her diamond necklace. "You have no proof," she hissed, but her eyes darted to Thomas Whitley, who had begun inching toward the exit. "Dr. Whitley, perhaps you'd care to explain to everyone the meaning of Project Sentinel?" I called out, stopping him in his tracks. "The behavioral modification program you've been implementing on James since he was 12 years old, designed to ensure complete compliance with family directives?" Whitley froze, his clinical detachment vanishing as 50 pairs of eyes turned to him. "That's privileged therapeutic information," he stammered, clinging to professional jargon as a shield. "Therapeutic?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call conditioning a child to respond to specific physical and verbal triggers? Programming responses that override his conscious will?" I gestured to James, who had sunk into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "Would you like to explain the monthly payments of $30,000 categorized as behavioral maintenance in the Harringtons' private ledgers?" I turned back to the gathering, using every skill I'd honed in the courtroom to hold their attention. My evidence package, which has now been received by the SEC, FBI, and the Boston Globe, contains over 2,000 documents detailing financial fraud, tax evasion, market manipulation, and, most disturbingly, the psychological abuse of James Harrington to maintain control of the family fortune. William Harrington stepped forward, adopting his most authoritative legal tone. "These are wild accusations from a disgruntled wife. If there were any truth to them—" "The Westlake acquisition," I interrupted, naming a deal that had made headlines the previous year. "Insider trading based on information obtained through blackmail of a Securities and Exchange Commission official. The documents include the original communications, the payments made to shell companies, and the exact trading patterns that followed." William's confident expression faltered as I named the specific transaction. I continued relentlessly. "The charitable donation to Boston Children's Hospital last year, lauded in every newspaper, 87% of those funds were redirected through 3 separate foundations before landing in an account controlled by Victoria Harrington in Zurich." I met Victoria's gaze directly. "Account number 8904-7721-3344-0012, opened under the name Helen Marsden, your mother's maiden name." The specificity of the details silenced any further objections. In the crowd, phones were now being used not just to read alerts, but to search for corroborating information. The evidence I'd spent years collecting was becoming public knowledge in real time. Victoria, ever the strategist, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Elise has been under tremendous pressure with her caseload," she began, adopting a concerned tone. "We've been worried about her mental health for months. Shall we discuss the surveillance system installed in our home during last year's renovation?" I countered. "Or the medication added to my evening tea on nights when I worked late on certain cases. I've had blood tests documenting the sedatives for months." A new murmur rippled through the crowd. The calculated gaslighting was exactly what many of these powerful women had experienced themselves in Boston's elite circles. I turned to Dr. Whitley, who stood paralyzed with indecision. "Dr. Whitley has a choice to make tonight," I announced. "The federal agents who have received my evidence package will be particularly interested in his records of the conditioning program. However," I paused deliberately, making sure he was listening closely, "I'm prepared to recommend immunity in exchange for his complete testimony about the methods used and who authorized them." Whitley's eyes widened at the lifeline being thrown. The same applies to anyone in this room, I continued, addressing the gathering. Those who come forward voluntarily with information will be viewed very differently from those who wait for subpoenas. The strategic fracturing of the Harrington alliance was happening faster than even I had anticipated. Already, small groups were forming, whispered conversations indicating alliances shifting like tectonic plates. James looked up at me, his eyes clearer than I'd seen them in months, the programming temporarily disrupted by the shock. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely audible. 3 years, I replied quietly. At first, I noticed small inconsistencies in your behavior after family meetings. Then the vacant episodes became more frequent. The final piece was finding Whitley's name on those payment records. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered, genuine anguish breaking through. "I know," I said and meant it. "That's why I've spent 3 years building this case instead of simply leaving. You weren't the only victim, James." Victoria, seeing her control slipping away completely, made a final desperate attempt. "This is absurd. James, tell them." But James was staring at the blood on my lip, a terrible recognition dawning as memories began breaking through the conditioning. "You did this to me," he said to his mother, his voice gaining strength. "All those sessions with Dr. Whitley when I was a child. The special educational programs every summer. This isn't the first time you've made me." He couldn't finish the sentence, horror washing over his features. The elevator doors opened, revealing 2 men in suits who surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "Perfect timing," I noted, recognizing my contacts from the FBI. "Gentlemen, I believe several people here are eager to make statements." The evidence I'd gathered was no longer just files on secured servers. It was unfolding in human drama across the rooftop terrace, as decades of manipulation, fraud, and control began to unravel thread by thread. And at the center stood Victoria, her empire crumbling, her mask of perfection finally, irrevocably shattered. The FBI agents moved with practiced efficiency, securing the exits while introducing themselves to the increasingly agitated crowd. One of them, Agent Rivera, whom I'd been feeding information to for months, gave me a nearly imperceptible nod as he approached Victoria. "Mrs. Harrington, we have a warrant to seize all electronic devices and documents in your possession," he stated, his tone professionally neutral as he presented the paperwork. Victoria's hand trembled as she took the document, her eyes scanning it with the desperate intensity of someone searching for an escape clause. Finding none, she turned to William, who had already begun backing away from her, the family's legal fixer already calculating his own exit strategy. "This is absurd," she insisted, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Do you know who I am? Who we know?" "That's precisely why we're here, Mrs. Harrington," Agent Rivera replied. Around us, the elegant birthday celebration had transformed into a scene of barely contained chaos. Servers stood frozen, champagne bottles still in hand, as the Boston elite began their strategic retreats. Judge Holloway was already speaking urgently into his phone. Senator Prescott's wife was tugging at his sleeve, distancing themselves from the Harrington nucleus. Phones continued buzzing with increasing urgency. I caught glimpses of headlines flashing across screens. Breaking: Harrington family under federal investigation. Boston's elite philanthropic family accused of massive fraud. Psychological manipulation allegations rock Harrington empire. The Boston Globe had moved faster than I'd anticipated, already publishing the first wave of revelations from my evidence package. Social media would be exploding within minutes. The carefully constructed Harrington mystique was unraveling in real time. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to maintain control, raising her voice to address the scattering guests. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding. A family dispute being tragically misrepresented." Her perfectly modulated voice cracked slightly. "I'm sure we can count on our friends too." Victoria, the police commissioner who moments ago had been laughing at her jokes, cut her off with a tight smile. "I think it's best if we speak tomorrow. Through counsel." The abandonment was beginning. Like rats from a sinking ship, the powerful figures who had protected the Harringtons for decades were rapidly recalculating their own exposure. Nearby, James had collapsed into a chair, his breathing ragged. The psychological walls constructed around his authentic self were crumbling, leaving him exposed to a flood of emerging memories and realizations. The summers at the lake house, he muttered, eyes unfocused. The special lessons with Dr. Whitley. The headaches whenever I questioned family decisions. I approached him cautiously, unsure of how stable he was in this transitional state. Despite everything, despite the sting of his slap still fresh on my face, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and concern. He had been both my tormentor and fellow victim. James, I said softly, kneeling beside him but maintaining a safe distance. The conditioning is breaking down. It's going to be disorienting. His eyes found mine, clearer than I'd seen them in years. I hurt you, he whispered, horror washing over his face as he reached toward my split lip, stopping short of touching me. I would never, but I did. I remember being told. You were programmed to respond to specific triggers, I explained, my voice steady. Victoria's whispered command activated a response that wasn't truly yours. Across the room, Thomas Whitley was already deep in conversation with the second FBI agent, his clinical detachment replaced by nervous self-preservation. I caught phrases like following instructions and didn't know the full extent. How much do you remember about the conditioning? I asked James. He pressed his palms against his temples. Fragments. Sessions in the study at the lake house. Words repeated while I was under medication. Punishments when I resisted. His voice broke. They've been doing this to me since I was 12. My own family. My own mother. The realization seemed to physically pain him, his body curling forward as if wounded. Here was the real James emerging from beneath layers of programming, vulnerable, horrified, genuine. Victoria, seeing our conversation, attempted to intervene despite the FBI agent beside her. James, darling, don't listen to her, she called, desperation making her voice shrill. She's turned you against your family. After everything we've done for you. After everything you've done to him, I corrected, rising to face her. The evidence includes video recordings of conditioning sessions, Victoria. Sessions where you personally instructed Dr. Whitley on which behaviors to suppress in your son. Victoria's face contorted, her carefully maintained facade finally shattering completely. He needed guidance, structure. The Harrington legacy had to be protected from his weakness. The naked truth of her perspective silenced the room. Even the FBI agents paused, witnessing the mask slip to reveal the monstrous priorities beneath. James stood shakily, years of programming warring with emerging clarity. My weakness was wanting my own life, he said, each word strengthening him. Wanting to study literature instead of finance. Wanting to marry for love instead of strategic advantage. His eyes found mine. Was any of it real between us? Or was I just following another script? The question pierced me. Despite everything I'd uncovered, despite my justified anger, I couldn't bring myself to twist the knife further. The beginning was real, I answered honestly. Before they intensified the conditioning. That's why I stayed. I saw glimpses of who you really were. Enough to know you were as much a victim as anyone they'd harmed. Outside, police lights now illuminated the night, reflecting off the harbor waters. More federal agents were arriving, along with evidence response teams. The Harrington Empire's collapse was accelerating by the minute. Victoria was being formally read her rights, her posture still regal despite everything crumbling around her. William was already negotiating, his legal mind calculating the benefits of early cooperation. Thomas Whitley sat alone, scribbling what appeared to be a detailed statement, occasionally glancing at James with what might have been regret. I stood at a crossroads. My vengeance was complete. The evidence I'd gathered would ensure justice for the financial crimes, the manipulation, the psychological abuse. I could walk away now, leave James to find his own path through the wreckage. But as I watched him struggling to process decades of psychological manipulation, I recognized something of myself in his disorientation. I had spent 5 years living a double life, maintaining a perfect facade while pursuing secret goals. We had both been changed by the Harringtons' toxic influence. I can help you understand what they did, I offered, surprising myself. I've documented the techniques, the triggers. It might help with your recovery. James looked up, vulnerability and hope warring with shame in his expression. After what I did to you, why would you help me? I touched my split lip, feeling the sting. Because unlike your family, I can distinguish between the puppets and the puppeteers. Around us, the Harrington Empire continued its spectacular implosion, years of manipulation and deceit exposed to the harsh light of justice. And in that chaos I made my choice. 6 months after my birthday celebration turned revelation, I sat in the federal courthouse watching Victoria Harrington enter in handcuffs. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup, replaced by a prison-issued jumpsuit and the pallor that came from confinement. Still, she held her head high, refusing to acknowledge the spectators who had come to witness the matriarch's downfall. The courtroom was packed with journalists, former business associates and, most importantly, others who had been victimized by the Harrington family over decades. Some I had found through financial records. Others had come forward after the initial reports broke. Each carried their own story of manipulation, coercion, or financial destruction. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Matsuda entered. Not Judge Holloway, who had recused himself immediately after my birthday revelation and was now under investigation himself for his role in several questionable Harrington judicial outcomes. The proceedings moved with the inexorable rhythm of justice finally unleashed. The prosecution presented evidence meticulously organized from my files and substantially expanded through the federal investigation that followed. Bank records, witness testimonies, psychological evaluations. The truth laid bare beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Victoria's legal team had crumbled in the preceding months. William Harrington had turned state's evidence almost immediately, prioritizing self-preservation over family loyalty. The prominent defense attorneys initially retained had withdrawn one by one as the depth of the evidence became clear. Now she sat beside a court-appointed defender who seemed overwhelmed by the case's complexity. During a recess, Mara Chin, one of the forensic accountants assigned to the case, approached me in the hallway. "We've traced over $480 million in misappropriated funds," she said quietly. "Your initial estimates were conservative." I nodded, unsurprised. "What about the trust?" "That's the interesting part," Mara replied. The grandfather's original trust document contained ethical operation clauses that the family had suppressed. The court is considering using those original provisions to redirect the assets toward restitution. This development validated my deepest hope, that justice wouldn't just mean punishment for the guilty, but restoration for the harmed. The Harrington fortune, built through generations of manipulation and fraud, would be used to heal the damage they had caused. Outside the courthouse steps each afternoon, I met with former employees, business partners, and even family members who had been pushed aside when they questioned Victoria's methods. Each shared pieces of the puzzle I hadn't known, extending the pattern of abuse and control back decades before my involvement with the family. Angela Harrington, James' cousin who had been disinherited at 19 for refusing Victoria's career guidance, became a particularly valuable ally. Her insights into the family dynamics helped prosecutors understand the systematic nature of the psychological manipulation. "They did it to all of us in different ways," she explained during one of our strategy sessions. "But James got the worst of it after his father died. Victoria saw him as the key to everything." Thomas Whitley's testimony proved devastating to Victoria's defense. In exchange for immunity, he provided detailed records of the conditioning techniques employed, the specific triggers installed, and Victoria's explicit instructions regarding James' development. The clinical precision of his notes left no room for doubt about the deliberate nature of the psychological abuse. James himself was absent from the proceedings, receiving treatment at a specialized facility focused on deprogramming and recovery from psychological manipulation. His own legal standing remained complex, both perpetrator and victim. The slap that had been the catalyst for the Harrington downfall was being considered in light of the documented conditioning. I visited him once a month, maintaining professional boundaries while providing information that aided his recovery. The man emerging from beneath the layers of programming was thoughtful, uncertain, and grappling with profound guilt over actions taken under his mother's influence. "I don't know who I am without their directives," he confessed during one visit, sitting in the facility's garden, the first hints of spring emerging around us. "Even my preferences, foods, clothes, opinions, I'm questioning everything." "That's actually progress," I told him. "The authentic self asks questions. The programmed self follows instructions." He managed a small smile, genuine, not the practiced expression I'd grown accustomed to during our marriage. You never stopped questioning, did you? Not my nature, I replied. Maybe that's why the conditioning didn't work on me. What remained unspoken between us was the future of our relationship. The marriage had been built on false premises, manipulated from the start by Victoria's machinations. Yet something authentic had existed briefly before the deeper programming took hold. Whether that could ever be recovered, or whether it should be, remained an open question neither of us was ready to answer. My own life had transformed completely. I had resigned from Caldwell and Pierce, unable to return to defending corporations after seeing how power could corrupt even the most prestigious institutions. Instead, I established the Cognitive Liberty Legal Foundation, focusing on cases involving psychological manipulation, coercive control, and financial exploitation. Our first clients were former Harrington employees who had been subjected to NDAs and coercive contracts. Within 3 months, we expanded to represent victims of other powerful families and corporations using similar tactics of psychological control. You've essentially created a new practice area, remarked my former mentor when we met for coffee. Psychological freedom as a legal right. The foundation's work soon extended beyond legal representation. We developed educational programs for law enforcement, judges, and therapists to recognize signs of psychological manipulation. I partnered with cognitive liberty advocates to push for legislative changes strengthening protections against coercive control. On the day Victoria Harrington was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy, I sat in the back of the courtroom rather than the front. Her empire had fallen. Justice had been served. My focus had already shifted to the next case, the next victim needing advocacy. As the courtroom emptied, James approached me, his first appearance at the proceedings. He looked different, thinner with casual clothes instead of bespoke suits, and eyes that held both sadness and clarity. The trustees approved the restitution plan, he said without preamble. Everyone they harmed will receive compensation, including you. I didn't do this for money, I replied. I know. He hesitated. That's why I asked them to direct my personal share to your foundation instead. It seems fitting that what they intended to control me with should be used to free others. The gesture represented something profound. An act of autonomous choice, perhaps the first truly independent decision he had made in decades. Thank you, I said simply. We stood there briefly, two people forever changed by the same corrupting influence, now finding our separate paths toward redemption. Your foundation's work, he started, then paused. I'd like to help when I'm further along in recovery. My experience might be useful to others. It might, I agreed. As we parted ways outside the courthouse, neither making promises about the future, I realized that the Harrington saga had never been just about exposing corruption or seeking personal vengeance. It had become something far more meaningful. A reclamation of authentic selfhood from those who would program human beings like software. The path ahead would be challenging, with more powerful families and institutions to confront. But with each case, each client, each small victory, I was building something that Victoria Harrington, with all her wealth and influence, had never possessed. A legacy of liberation rather than control. That, perhaps, was the most perfect form of justice. My boss uninvited me from the company's luxury retreat, saying my presence would bring down the caliber of attendees. He collapsed when the island resort manager welcomed me as the owner's daughter and showed everyone to the presidential villa I'd reserved in my name. Your presence would bring down the caliber of attendees. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke as I stood frozen in Richard's doorway, my professional smile still plastered across my face while something inside me cracked. My boss leaned back in his Italian leather chair, fingers steepled, wearing that particular expression I'd come to recognize. False sympathy barely masking smug satisfaction. I just don't think you're executive material yet, Emma, he continued, his voice carrying just loud enough to reach curious ears in the open office beyond. The Sullivan Island Resort is extremely exclusive. Our clients expect a certain level of polish. His gaze flicked dismissively over my sensible navy blazer and practical pumps. The irony might have been comical if it weren't so painful. Sullivan Island Resort. My father's crowning achievement, named after our family, the place where I'd spent childhood summers helping the staff fold towels and learning to swim. Before we begin, I want to thank you for joining this journey. Ever felt overlooked despite your talents? Today's story of a brilliant marketing executive facing workplace discrimination might hit close to home. If you enjoy tales of reclaiming your power and standing in your truth, hit subscribe. It's free and helps our community grow. Now, let's watch as Emma's boss discovers exactly whose daughter he's been underestimating. I am Emma Sullivan, daughter of Robert Sullivan, the reclusive resort magnate, as the business press calls him. Not that anyone at Horizon Marketing knew this. That was entirely by design. I understand, I replied evenly, though my heartbeat hammered in my ears. Thank you for the clarification. Walking back to my desk through the maze of suddenly busy coworkers pretending not to have overheard everything, I maintained perfect posture. Another lesson from my father. Never let them see weakness, Emmy, he'd say. The moment they smell blood, they'll tear you apart. 3 years ago, fresh out of my MBA program where I'd graduated top of my class, I'd made a decision that confused everyone who knew my background. Instead of taking my rightful place in the Sullivan Hospitality Group empire, I chose a mid-level position at a modest marketing agency. My father had been puzzled but supportive. Find your own path, he'd said. That's a luxury my money should afford you. I'd watched wealth isolate him over the years. People either wanting something or too intimidated to be authentic. His 3 failed marriages were testament to how money complicated human connection. I was determined to succeed or fail on my own merits, to know that the relationships I built were genuine. My apartment in the unfashionable part of town was comfortable but unremarkable. My 5-year-old Honda was reliable if unimpressive. My wardrobe consisted of quality basics rather than designer labels. These weren't hardships to me, they were choices that reflected my values. Richard Blackwell, however, interpreted my lack of status symbols as a lack of ambition, perhaps even ability. The Henderson Beauty campaign mock-ups need revision, Lisa from accounts said, dropping a folder on my desk, interrupting my thoughts. Richard wants them by morning. The Henderson campaign. My campaign had already been approved by the client last week. These revisions were undoubtedly Richard's attempt to keep me too busy to dwell on my exclusion from the retreat. Of course, I replied with a professional nod. This was familiar territory. Last month, it had been my concept for the Mitchell sports drink that Richard presented to the client himself, conveniently forgetting to mention that the entire campaign framework had been mine. The month before, I'd been mysteriously uninvited from the final pitch meeting for the Wilson retail account after developing their entire rebrand strategy. Richard had a particular talent for undermining without leaving evidence. The women's cosmetics accounts, the household products, the softer brands always seemed to land on my desk, regardless of my proven track record with technology clients and financial services. My computer pinged with an email notification from Margot Winters, the newly hired VP of Client Relations. Can you drop by my office at 4? Want to discuss your thinking on Apex? Brilliant work. MW. This message alone would send Richard into a strategic panic. Margot had witnessed my presentation on digital transformation strategy last week and had asked several insightful questions. Unlike Richard, she'd openly acknowledged the depth of my research and the innovation in my approach. That single moment of professional recognition had felt like rainfall in a desert. Richard had noticed our connection immediately. His eyes had narrowed during the meeting as Margot engaged with my ideas, and afterward he'd hovered nearby when she complimented my work, quickly interjecting himself into the conversation. As I gathered my notes for the meeting with Margot, I caught Richard watching me from across the office, his expression calculating. He'd been increasingly agitated since I'd landed the Apex Technologies account, a major tech firm that had specifically requested me after seeing my work on a smaller project. The Apex win should have been celebrated. Instead, Richard had immediately assigned Tyler and Jason to support me. You'll need backup on this one, Emma, he'd said with a tight smile. It's a big account for someone at your level. Both men were junior to me in experience and position, but they were unquestionably members of Richard's boys' club, frequently invited to his golf outings and whiskey tastings. Their addition to my project wasn't support. It was dilution, a transparent attempt to split the credit 3 ways when success came, or to have scapegoats if anything went wrong. Margot's office door was open when I arrived, and she waved me in with genuine warmth. Emma, come in. I've been reviewing your Apex proposal again. The integration of AI predictive analytics with traditional consumer behavior models is fascinating. For the next 30 minutes, we engaged in the kind of substantive professional conversation I'd been craving. No politics, no posturing, just authentic exchange of ideas. When she suggested becoming more involved with the Apex account, I felt something dangerous. Hope? Richard mentioned you won't be joining us at the retreat next week, Margot said as our meeting concluded. That's disappointing. It would be valuable to have your perspective. My carefully constructed professional mask nearly slipped. So Richard had already been laying groundwork, likely suggesting I'd decline the invitation due to some personal inadequacy. Yes, unfortunately I won't be attending, I replied neutrally. Well, we'll catch up when we return, she said with a smile that seemed genuine. I see tremendous potential in your work, Emma. As I walked back to my desk, I noticed Richard emerging from the conference room with Tyler and Jason, all three laughing comfortably. They quieted as I approached, exchanging glances. Emma, Richard said with artificial brightness. The guys have had some great ideas for the Apex campaign. We're thinking of pivoting from your original concept. More dynamic, more cutting edge. We can discuss when I'm back from the retreat. And there it was, the familiar pattern. The retreat would happen without me, decisions would be made in my absence, and my work would be repackaged under someone else's name. But this time would be different. The Sullivan Island Resort wasn't just any luxury destination. It was my legacy, my history, my name literally carved into the foundation stone. As Richard walked away, I made my decision. For 3 years, I'd hidden in the shadows of my privilege, rejecting it in pursuit of authentic achievement. But perhaps it was time to step into the light on my own terms. I pulled out my phone and sent a text to a number I rarely used. Dad, we need to talk about the company retreat next week at the resort. I have a favor to ask. Dad didn't call back immediately after my text. That was typical. He was probably in some high-level meeting, or perhaps taking his evening swim in the private cove at our family's main estate. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to delayed responses, understanding that his empire demanded constant attention. So I tucked my phone away and focused on reworking the Henderson campaign mock-ups that didn't actually need reworking. The next morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill. I was already at my desk by 7:30, a full hour before most colleagues would arrive, when my phone finally lit up with my father's response. Interesting timing. That location was specifically requested by someone at Horizon. Call me after your all-hands meeting today. My blood ran cold. The monthly all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., and I hadn't mentioned it to my father. Somehow he already knew about it. Typical Robert Sullivan. Always 3 steps ahead with information that should have been impossible to obtain. It was both impressive and unnerving, even as his daughter. By 9:55, the glass-walled conference room was filling with the entire Horizon marketing staff. I selected a seat halfway back. Visible enough to be present, far enough to avoid unwanted attention. Richard stood at the front, practically bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement, while his assistant Julia arranged branded gift bags on a side table. Good morning, team. Richard's voice boomed with theatrical enthusiasm as the clock struck 10. Before we dive into department updates, I have a special announcement that I've been absolutely dying to share. He clicked to his first slide. A stunning aerial photograph of a lush tropical island with pristine beaches and an architectural marvel perched on its hillside. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that exact view. It was the marketing shot I'd helped approve 3 years ago for the Sullivan Island Resort brochures. Ladies and gentlemen, as a reward for our exceptional Q3 performance, Horizon's top performers will be attending a 4-day executive retreat at the exclusive Sullivan Island Resort. The room erupted in excited murmurs. Sullivan Island Resort was notorious for its exclusivity, with waiting lists extending months even for the wealthiest clients. Celebrities sought its privacy, tech billionaires its discretion, and politicians its security. The average person would never set foot on its immaculate shores. For those unfamiliar, Richard continued, clearly relishing being the bearer of such news, Sullivan Island Resort is consistently ranked among the top 3 most exclusive destinations in the world. Rooms start at $5,000 per night, but we won't be staying in rooms. He paused dramatically. We'll be in private villas. More gasps and whispers. I sat perfectly still, maintaining a neutral expression while my mind raced. This wasn't just any Sullivan property. It was our flagship, my father's pride and joy, The resort where I'd learned to snorkel, where I knew every staff member by name, where the head chef Marcos still made my favorite passion fruit soufflé whenever I visited. This is an exceptional networking opportunity, Richard emphasized, clicking to the next slide. Several industry leaders will be staying on the island during our visit. The connections we make could transform Horizon's client roster for years to come. The following slide displayed a list of attendees. I scanned it automatically, then did a double take. My name wasn't there. I rechecked, certain it was a mistake. The list included all department heads, the executive team, several mid-level managers, and even some junior staff members who were Richard's obvious favorites. But Emma Sullivan was conspicuously absent. Richard's eyes met mine briefly as he scrolled through the slide, a subtle smirk playing at the corner of his mouth before he quickly moved on to discuss logistics. This wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. Departure is next Thursday morning. Julia has prepared welcome packages with all the details, he concluded, gesturing to the gift bags. If your name was on the list, please collect your package after the meeting. The remainder of the all-hands passed in a blur of departmental updates and quarterly projections that I couldn't focus on. My mind kept returning to the missing name, my name, and the calculated slight it represented. When the meeting finally adjourned, I watched colleagues eagerly grab their tropical-themed gift bags while avoiding eye contact with me. I waited until the initial excitement died down before approaching Richard's office. Taking a steadying breath, I knocked on his open door with controlled professionalism. "Do you have a moment to discuss the retreat?" I asked, maintaining the pleasant, non-confrontational tone I'd perfected over years of navigating corporate politics. "Emma." "Of course, come in," Richard replied with exaggerated welcome, not bothering to stand. He didn't close the door, the first warning sign. "I noticed my name wasn't on the attendee list," I began evenly. "Given that I'm leading the Apex account and we exceeded our targets by 22% this quarter, I wanted to check if it was an oversight." Richard's expression shifted from false warmth to something colder, more authentic. "It wasn't an oversight, Emma. This retreat is for team members who exemplify Horizon's executive vision." "I'm not sure I understand," I said, though I understood perfectly. "How can I put this delicately?" He leaned forward, keeping his voice just loud enough to carry. "Your presence would bring down the caliber of attendees. Your work is," he paused, "adequate, but your overall presentation lacks the polish we need when networking with potential high-value clients." Each word was precision-engineered to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Nothing overtly discriminatory, nothing actionable, just devastating personal criticism delivered with a veneer of professional concern. "Your presentation style is basic at best," he continued, gaining momentum. "The retreat will feature formal dinners, executive mingles. Your lackluster presence and frankly uninspired wardrobe choices would reflect poorly on Horizon." I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck but kept my expression neutral, acutely aware of colleagues in nearby cubicles pretending not to listen while absorbing every syllable. "Perhaps you could use this time to develop more executive presence," Richard suggested with faux helpfulness. "Maybe invest in a more professional wardrobe? Those sensible shoes and off-the-rack blazers might work for client meetings in the city, but Sullivan Island is another level entirely." The irony was almost painful. I probably knew the dress code expectations at Sullivan Island better than anyone in the building. I'd helped write them. "I appreciate your feedback," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "Is there anything else I should focus on during your absence?" "The Henderson revisions, of course, and preliminary work on the Wilson holiday campaign. Nothing too strategic. Tyler can handle direction when we return." He waved dismissively. "That'll be all, Emma." I walked back to my desk through what felt like an invisible corridor of judgment. Colleagues suddenly needed to check their phones or became deeply engrossed in their monitors as I passed. No one made eye contact. No one offered even a sympathetic glance. That's when I made my decision. For 3 years I'd suppressed my background, denied my connections, and pursued validation through merit alone. And what had it gotten me? Exclusion, undermining, and public humiliation. I pulled out my phone and sent my father a second text. "Let's make some arrangements for next week. But on my terms." It was time for Richard Blackwell to learn exactly whose caliber he'd been questioning. My apartment felt different that evening. smaller somehow, as though the walls were pressing in with the weight of the day's humiliation. I kicked off my sensible pumps, tossed my supposedly inadequate blazer over a chair, and poured myself 2 fingers of the 30-year-old Macallan my father had gifted me last Christmas. The one luxury I permitted myself behind closed doors. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as I took my first sip and stared out at the city lights. My phone buzzed on the counter. Dad was calling. "Hey Dad," I answered, trying to sound normal but hearing the strain in my own voice. "Emma." His tone was gentle but probing. "What's this about the retreat? I thought you were keeping work and family strictly separated." I sank onto my couch, suddenly exhausted. That was the plan. Until my boss decided I wasn't caliber enough to attend a retreat at our own resort. The words tumbled out, laced with more bitterness than I'd intended. Dad was silent for a moment and I could picture his expression. The one where his eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened slightly. The look that had made business rivals tremble. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "One call and this Richard person won't just be uninvited from the resort. He'll be uninvited from his job." "No." I sat up straighter. "That's exactly what I don't want. I've spent 3 years building a career without your intervention. And look where that's gotten you, excluded and disrespected." "It's gotten me authentic experience," I countered. "If you step in now, everything I've worked for becomes meaningless. I need to handle this myself." The line went quiet, save for the distant sound of waves from his end. He was on the terrace at the main house, probably watching the sunset over the Pacific. "What do you propose?" he asked finally. "Let them come to the resort. Let events unfold naturally." I took another sip of whiskey, feeling a plan crystallize. "But I need Carlos to know I'm coming, and I need the presidential villa." Dad chuckled, his mood instantly lighter. "The presidential villa? The one you helped design? That's a $25,000 per night booking." "Precisely." For the first time that day I smiled. "And I need you not to warn them who I am. Let me handle the reveal myself." "This sounds like the Emma I know," he said, pride evident in his voice. "The presidential villa is yours. I'll have Carlos prepare everything to your specifications." After we hung up, I didn't immediately succumb to sleep despite my exhaustion. Instead, I opened my laptop and began meticulously documenting every instance of Richard's discrimination, every snide comment, every stolen idea, and every project reassignment. By 2 a.m., I had compiled a comprehensive record of 3 years' worth of subtle undermining and not-so-subtle dismissals. The temptation to resign immediately was strong, but that would be emotional, not strategic. Richard needed to learn a lesson, not simply lose an employee he didn't value. And Horizon, despite its flaws, had other talented staff who deserved better leadership. Perhaps, I thought as I finally drifted off, this could be an opportunity for broader change. The following week was an exercise in restraint. Richard seemed to take particular pleasure in discussing retreat plans within my earshot, often pausing his conversations to ask me pointed questions. "Emma, we're debating whether to go snorkeling or sailing first day. Any thoughts?" "Oh wait," he'd smirk. "You won't be there to worry about it." Each time I'd simply smile and continue working. My apparent lack of reaction seemed to frustrate him, driving him to escalate his provocations. "The Henderson campaign looks passable," he remarked, dropping my revised mock-ups on my desk. "Work up some alternate concepts while we're gone. Should be plenty quiet around here for you to focus." "Of course," I replied pleasantly. "Anything else you need before your departure?" My calm seemed to unsettle him. He'd expected tears, resignation, or confrontation, not this measured professionalism. By Wednesday, 3 days before the retreat, he'd assigned me 4 additional projects with urgent deadlines that mysteriously coincided with the team's return. The most telling disappointment came from Margot. After our promising connection, I'd hoped she might question my exclusion or at least maintain our professional relationship. Instead, she began avoiding me entirely. Twice I caught her changing direction in the hallway upon seeing me. When we were unavoidably in the same meeting, she addressed her comments to others, even when responding to my points. It culminated Thursday afternoon when I approached her office to discuss the Apex timeline. "Not a good time," she said briskly, not looking up from her monitor. "Send me an email. I'll review it after the retreat." "I thought you wanted to be involved with Apex," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She finally looked up, expression carefully blank. Priorities have shifted. Richard feels the account needs a more executive approach. I see. And I did see, crystal clear. Margot had made her calculations. Aligning with the excluded employee offered less value than cementing her position with the boss. Corporate allyship at its finest. Nothing personal, she added, already looking back at her screen, dismissing me. The sting of betrayal was sharp but clarifying. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about an entire culture that rewarded the wrong values. By Friday morning, the office was abuzz with pre-retreat excitement. Colleagues compared notes on resort wear and sunscreen recommendations. A table in the break room displayed newly purchased sunglasses and sun hats as people showed off their retreat preparations. No one approached my desk or met my eyes. I maintained my composed facade while confirming final arrangements via text with Carlos, the resort manager who'd known me since I was 10. Everything was prepared exactly as requested. That evening, I received an encrypted email from my father containing dozens of high-resolution photographs of the presidential villa's recent renovation, a project I'd contributed significant design input to during my final year of college. The soaring windows overlooking the private beach, the infinity pool that seemed to blend into the ocean horizon, the 6 luxurious bedroom suites, each with a unique theme inspired by different Sullivan properties around the world. I studied each image carefully, mentally mapping the space where Richard's humiliation would unfold. The grand entrance with its 20-foot ceilings. The open-concept living area where welcome champagne would be served. The exact spot where Carlos would make the introduction that would change everything. As I packed my own bag, not for the commercial flight the Horizon team would take tomorrow, but for my father's private jet that would depart 3 hours earlier, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, anticipation without anxiety. For 3 years I'd hidden my true self, seeking validation that would never come from people who judged by appearances rather than substance. That ended tomorrow. I wasn't just reclaiming my name, I was reclaiming my worth. My phone lit up with a final text from Dad, jet-fueled and waiting. Presidential villa prepared to your specifications. Carlos sends his regards and says revenge is best served with ocean views. I smiled and responded simply, tell him I prefer it served with clarity. Tomorrow, Richard Blackwell would learn exactly whose caliber he had been questioning. Morning arrived with perfect cinematic timing, clear skies, gentle breeze, and sunlight that seemed to illuminate possibilities rather than realities. The private Sullivan jet waited on the tarmac, its sleek silhouette familiar and yet somehow new in this context. For the first time in 3 years I was stepping fully into both worlds. Emma the marketing strategist and Emma Sullivan, heiress to a hospitality empire. Welcome aboard, Miss Sullivan. The flight attendant greeted me with the warm professionalism unique to our longest-serving staff. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you, Diane. How's your daughter doing at UCLA? Her face brightened with surprised pleasure. She's thriving in the architecture program. I can't believe you remembered. Of course I did. Please send her my congratulations. This was the difference between genuine connection and performance. I actually cared about our staff and their lives. Something Richard, for all his executive posturing, would never understand. The 3-hour flight passed in peaceful preparation. Instead of my usual, inadequate work attire, I'd chosen an understated but unmistakably expensive white linen dress, gold sandals from a small Italian designer, and a single piece of jewelry, my mother's sapphire pendant that matched the Sullivan Resort's signature blue. Nothing flashy but everything quality. The look said I belong here without screaming it. Carlos was waiting on the private landing strip when we touched down, his familiar smile as bright as the Caribbean sun overhead. Little Emma, he exclaimed, embracing me with genuine affection before stepping back to study my face. Though not so little anymore. Your father said you've become quite the marketing genius. Hardly a genius, I laughed. Just hardworking and underestimated. A powerful combination. He winked, offering his arm as we walked toward the waiting golf cart. Now tell me exactly how you want this to unfold. Your father mentioned something about an appropriate comeuppance for some very deserving individuals. For the next hour, Carlos and I meticulously planned the choreography of the afternoon's revelation. The Horizon team would arrive at 2 p.m., giving us ample time to prepare. I showed him photos of Richard so he would recognize my boss immediately, explained the dynamics I wanted to highlight, and emphasized one critical point. I don't want anyone fired or the retreat ruined. This isn't about destruction, it's about recalibration. Understood completely, Carlos nodded. Though I must say, your father seemed disappointed when I relayed your instruction not to accidentally lose your boss's luggage in the ocean. We shared a knowing laugh. Dad's protective instincts were legendary. By 1:30, I had taken my position in the resort's grand lobby, partially concealed behind an extravagant arrangement of native flowers and foliage. The strategic location offered perfect sightlines to the entrance while keeping me hidden from immediate view. Carlos stood at the reception desk, reviewing final details with his staff, occasionally catching my eye with subtle nods of reassurance. At precisely 2:07 p.m., the doors swung open and the Horizon marketing team streamed in, faces flushed with excitement and the mild humidity. Richard led the procession, designer sunglasses perched on his head, wearing a tropical shirt that still had visible fold lines from its packaging. Behind him trailed the executive team, then department heads, and finally the chosen favorites from junior ranks. This, Richard announced dramatically, arms spread wide as though personally presenting the resort to his subordinates, is what true luxury looks like. From my hidden vantage point, I watched my colleagues' genuine awe as they absorbed the soaring ceilings with their hand-carved details, the panoramic ocean views, and the tasteful display of indigenous art. Phones immediately appeared as everyone began documenting their arrival, posing before they'd even properly checked in. Remember everyone, Richard's voice carried throughout the lobby, we are representing Horizon here. I've personally been to Sullivan Properties before and can tell you they have extremely high standards. I suppressed a smile, knowing for a fact that Richard had never stayed at any Sullivan property. Our minimal digital footprint and invitation-only booking system made lying about past stays a common but easily disproven boast. The owner himself is famously particular, Richard continued, his fabrications growing bolder. Robert Sullivan and I actually discussed marketing strategies when I encountered him in Aspen last winter. My eyebrows shot up. Dad hadn't been to Aspen in over 5 years, preferring our properties in the southern hemisphere during winter months. The audacity of Richard's lie was almost impressive. When approaching staff, remember they've served actual celebrities. Act like you belong, he instructed, adjusting his collar importantly. Speaking of which, Jennifer Lawrence stayed in this very resort last month. We had a lovely chat by the infinity pool. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing outright. Jennifer Lawrence had indeed stayed recently, in the same presidential villa that awaited them, but the resort's strict privacy protocols meant no other guest would have been allowed near her private pool area. Richard's fantasy world was about to collide spectacularly with reality. Carlos caught my eye, giving the subtlest nod. Showtime. He approached the group with the perfect balance of deference and authority that had made him legendary in luxury hospitality circles. Welcome to Sullivan Island Resort. I'm Carlos Mendez, General Manager. We're delighted to have Horizon Marketing with us. Richard immediately stepped forward, hand extended. Richard Blackwell, President of Horizon. I believe my assistant confirmed our arrangements for the executive ocean villas. Indeed, Mr. Blackwell, Carlos nodded politely. However, there's been a significant upgrade to your accommodations. Richard's expression shifted to calculating pleasure, likely assuming his name-dropping had somehow earned special treatment. Carlos continued, if you'll just allow me to greet. He paused, eyes scanning the lobby before finding me. Miss Sullivan. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement, feeling all eyes instantly turn in my direction. Richard's face registered confusion as Carlos walked past him and embraced me warmly. We've been eagerly anticipating your return, Carlos said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Your father called personally to ensure everything is prepared to your exact specifications. The silence was absolute. I could practically hear the mental gears grinding as my colleagues processed what they were witnessing. Thank you, Carlos, I replied, matching his volume. It's wonderful to be home. Richard's face underwent a remarkable transformation, confusion dissolving into disbelief, then morphing into horrified recognition. The blood drained from his features so rapidly that for a moment I worried he might actually faint. Emma, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. I turned to him with a pleasant smile. Hello, Richard. Surprise. He took a stumbling step backward, colliding with the reception desk. A staff member reached out to steady him as he gripped the counter edge for support. But you, how? Sullivan? He stuttered, looking between Carlos and me with increasing panic. Carlos, consummate professional that he was, continued as though nothing unusual was happening. Everyone, please follow me to the presidential villa that Miss Sullivan has graciously reserved for your company's use. The presidential villa? Margot echoed, finding her voice first among my stunned colleagues. Yes, Carlos confirmed cheerfully. The crown jewel of our property. $25,000 per night, though of course there's no charge for Ms. Sullivan's guests. As Carlos led the shell-shocked group toward the waiting golf carts, I fell into step beside Richard, who was still struggling to compose himself. Don't worry, I said quietly for his ears only. I wouldn't dream of bringing down the caliber of attendees. After all, this is what true luxury looks like. The procession through the lobby felt surreal. I walked beside Carlos with practiced ease while my colleagues shuffled behind us like bewildered tourists. In my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of their transformation. The same people who had avoided eye contact with me for days were now attempting to catch my attention with eager smiles and nervous waves. Jason, who had been assigned to support my Apex project, actually bumped into a marble column because he was staring at me instead of watching where he was walking. Tyler, the other junior executive Richard had placed on my project, whispered something urgently to Margot, who nodded while maintaining a frozen smile in my direction. Richard trailed slightly behind, his breathing audibly labored as though he'd run a marathon instead of walking across a lobby. The man who had dominated every room at Horizon now seemed physically diminished, his shoulders hunched as though trying to become invisible. The contrast was so striking that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Your golf carts await, Carlos announced as we exited onto a covered pavilion where a line of luxury vehicles stood ready. Miss Sullivan, will you be riding in the lead cart with me? I'd be delighted, I replied, noticing Richard step forward automatically before realizing the invitation wasn't for him. He retreated awkwardly as Carlos helped me into the front passenger seat. Our small convoy wound through the lush tropical landscape, following paths I knew by heart. As we passed a particular grove of palm trees, I turned to Carlos with genuine warmth. The coconut palms look beautiful. Maria's team has done wonders with the landscaping this season. She'll be thrilled you noticed, Carlos replied. She still talks about how you helped her plan the native plant restoration project when you were just 15. From the back seat, I heard a small gasp from Lisa, our HR director who had been assigned to ride with us. Her expression in the side mirror revealed the dawning realization that my knowledge of the resort wasn't something hastily researched to impress colleagues. As we continued, I pointed out features to Carlos that I knew would be overheard. I see Dad finally implemented my suggestion about the meditation pavilion near the East Cove. The placement catches the sunrise perfectly. Your design input has always been valued, Carlos responded naturally. The architects still reference your college thesis on integrative luxury spaces when discussing renovations. Each casual exchange reinforced what Richard and the others were rapidly discovering. My connection to the Sullivan brand wasn't just familial. It was foundational. I had helped shape the very paradise they had been so excited to visit, the exclusive sanctuary they had deemed me unworthy of entering. Our procession arrived at the presidential villa, its dramatic architecture rising from the cliffside to command breathtaking ocean views from three sides. The staff stood ready in a welcoming formation that I recognized as our VIP protocol, the same greeting we would give to visiting heads of state or international celebrities. Welcome to your home for the next 4 days, Carlos announced to the group as we entered the soaring main hall with its 20-foot windows and indigenous hardwood details. Miss Sullivan has arranged for the entire villa to be at your exclusive disposal. The collective intake of breath was audible as my colleagues absorbed the staggering luxury of the space. The infinity pool that seemed to merge with the ocean horizon, the museum-quality art collection, the multiple lounge areas with their bespoke furnishings. Carlos, would you mind if I handle the room assignments? I asked, taking the villa's tablet from him with practiced familiarity. I have some specific thoughts on which spaces would best suit each guest. Of course, Miss Sullivan, he replied with the barest hint of a conspiratorial smile. I tapped through the tablet with deliberate casualness. Let's see. Julia and Lisa, You'll be in the Ocean Master Suites. Their eyes widened at being assigned the villa's most prestigious accommodations, typically reserved for the highest-ranking executives. Tyler and Jason, you'll have the Coral Suites with the private plunge pools. One by one, I assigned the most luxurious rooms to the junior staff members who had shown me basic human decency over the years, working my way up the corporate hierarchy in reverse. Margot's expression soured as she realized she would be in one of the smaller suites, though still obscenely luxurious by any normal standard. Finally, only Richard remained unassigned. And Richard, you'll be in the Garden Suite. I smiled pleasantly. What I didn't mention was that this particular room, while comfortable, had originally been designed for personal staff accompanying VIP guests. It was the only suite without an ocean view, overlooking the service entrance instead. Staff will show you to your accommodations, I continued smoothly. Please take time to refresh and relax. We'll gather for welcome cocktails on the main terrace at sunset, followed by dinner at 8. As the group dispersed, Richard approached me with the desperate smile of a drowning man spotting a distant lifeboat. Emma, Miss Sullivan, might I have a word in private? I led him to a small sitting area partially screened by tropical plants, deliberately choosing a spot where we would still be visible to others but not audible. Emma, he began, voice trembling slightly, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding. Really? I kept my expression neutral. Please elaborate. My decision regarding your attendance at the retreat, it wasn't what you think. He leaned forward, eyes darting nervously. I was actually protecting you. Protecting me? I repeated, allowing genuine curiosity to color my tone. Absolutely. His confidence seemed to grow with my apparent receptiveness. I suspected you might have connections here. Intuition really from our past conversations. I was concerned that if others discovered your family ties, they might try to exploit the relationship professionally. The audacity of this transparent fabrication was almost impressive. I maintained eye contact but offered no response, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably. The comment about caliber, completely misinterpreted, he continued desperately. I meant you were above the caliber of our regular corporate retreats. Too sophisticated, really. When I still didn't respond, he added, I've always valued your contributions, Emma. Always. I let the statement hang in the air until the silence became physically uncomfortable. How interesting, I finally said, standing up. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on dinner arrangements. The evening unfolded exactly as I'd envisioned during those meticulous planning sessions. The welcome dinner was served on the main terrace as the sun painted the sky in impossible shades of orange and pink. The executive chef, who had taught me to make my first soufflé when I was 12, prepared a 7-course tasting menu featuring local delicacies and Sullivan's signature dishes. As we dined, I found myself genuinely enjoying the expressions of surprise on my colleagues' faces when I casually discussed wine vintages with the sommelier, recognized subtle flavor profiles in each course, and shared anecdotes about the artists whose work adorned the villa walls. These weren't affectations or performances. They were genuine parts of myself I had deliberately suppressed at Horizon to avoid standing out. Across the table, Richard picked at his food, attempting occasional contributions to the conversation that fell awkwardly flat. His usual bombastic confidence had evaporated, replaced by a painful awareness that the corporate hierarchy he'd wielded so comfortably had been completely inverted in a single afternoon. By the time dessert was served, the message had been received by everyone present. True power didn't need to announce itself, and genuine accomplishment couldn't be faked. The real Emma Sullivan had finally stepped into the light, and she wasn't going anywhere. The final morning of the retreat dawned with a clarity that seemed symbolic. For 3 days, my colleagues had navigated this new reality with varying degrees of adaptation. Some, like the junior staff members, had blossomed in an environment where their ideas were suddenly valued. Others, particularly those who had been complicit in Richard's behavior, maintained a careful distance, unsure where they stood in this recalibrated world. Richard himself had become a ghost of his former self, appearing at scheduled activities with a subdued demeanor that bordered on meekness. His usual domineering presence had vanished, replaced by a man who seemed afraid of his own shadow, or more accurately, afraid of mine. I was reviewing the day's agenda with Carlos when his expression shifted to one of pleased surprise. Looking past me toward the villa's main entrance, he nodded respectfully. It appears we have an unexpected visitor. I turned to find my father walking through the grand doorway, his commanding presence immediately filling the space. At 62, Robert Sullivan remained an imposing figure. Tall, fit, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that could assess a business opportunity or an individual's character with equal precision. "Dad!" I exclaimed, genuinely surprised. We had agreed he would stay away to allow me to handle the situation independently. "Good morning, sweetheart," he replied, embracing me warmly before turning to greet Carlos. I noticed my colleagues at the breakfast buffet freeze in place, recognition dawning on their faces. Robert Sullivan rarely appeared in public or business publications, but when he did, it was impossible to mistake him. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Dad said, loud enough for others to hear. I couldn't resist seeing how Horizon Marketing was enjoying our humble accommodations. "Not at all," I replied, playing along with his humble characterization of the $25,000 per night villa. "We were just about to have breakfast. Will you join us?" "I'd be delighted." The meal that followed was a masterclass in subtle intimidation. Dad was unfailingly polite as I introduced him to each team member, but his gaze lingered a fraction longer on those I had privately mentioned as Richard's enablers. When Richard himself approached with an extended hand and nervous smile, Dad's handshake was brief and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Fascinating property you have here, Mr. Sullivan," Richard offered weakly. "Thank you," Dad replied. "Though I must apologize for our communication system. The villa's microphones are surprisingly sensitive. Picked up some interesting conversations yesterday. Something about caliber of attendees." He glanced at me with a raised eyebrow. "Technical glitch we're working on." Richard's face drained of color as he realized his private comments in his room had been overheard. Though Dad was bluffing, our privacy standards would never allow such monitoring. Richard had no way of knowing that. As the team finished breakfast, Dad stood to address the group. "I'd like to propose a slight change to today's agenda with Emma's permission." I nodded, curious where he was going with this. "Instead of the scheduled golf tournament, I've arranged for a special team-building activity supporting the island's coral reef restoration project. It's something close to my heart and to Emma's." He gestured to a display set up near the terrace doors that hadn't been there earlier. Photographs of previous restoration efforts, charts showing progress, and I was startled to see several images of myself from over the years, working alongside marine biologists and local conservationists. "What many of you may not know," Dad continued, "is that Emma has been anonymously funding similar environmental initiatives for years. In fact, the educational component of our coral nursery program was largely her design." Murmurs rippled through the assembled group as this new information registered. The Emma they thought they knew, the one they had judged as lacking caliber, had been quietly making significant contributions while seeking no recognition. Following breakfast, the team changed into appropriate attire and headed to the Marine Conservation Center where local experts guided them through the process of preparing coral fragments for transplantation. I found myself working alongside junior team members who were suddenly eager to engage with me, asking thoughtful questions about both the conservation project and my marketing insights. During a break, I noticed Richard standing alone at the edge of the beach, staring out at the horizon. The moment had arrived. I walked over, carrying a folder I had retrieved from my room. "Beautiful view," I commented, standing beside him. He flinched slightly, then nodded. "Emma, Before you say anything else," I interrupted gently, "I'd like you to review these documents." I handed him the folder containing my meticulously compiled evidence. Emails, meeting notes, project reassignments, patterns of discrimination, and instances where my ideas had been attributed to others. He flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from defensive to defeated as he recognized the undeniable pattern revealed by his own actions and words. "I could present these to the board," I said quietly, "or file a formal complaint." "You're going to destroy me," he whispered. "No," I replied. "That was never my intention. I'm offering you something else, redemption." His head snapped up in surprise. "Mandatory sensitivity training. A complete restructuring of Horizon's advancement policies to ensure transparency and merit-based promotion. And your public support for these changes." "And if I refuse?" "Then yes, these documents go to the board." But I'm hoping you'll choose growth over destruction. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of waves and distant voices from our colleagues. Why? He finally asked. Why offer me a way out after everything? Because revenge might feel satisfying momentarily, but it doesn't create lasting change. Transformation does. That evening's closing dinner was held on the beach, with torches illuminating tables set directly on the sand. As the meal concluded, I rose to address the group, feeling a sense of purpose I'd been lacking for too long. 3 years ago, I made a choice to hide part of my identity in pursuit of authentic achievement. I began. I wanted to succeed or fail based on my own merits, not my family name. I glanced around at the attentive faces. What I discovered instead was how privilege operates in subtle ways, even when you try to set it aside. My experience at Horizon opened my eyes to challenges that many face without the safety net I always had, regardless of how I lived my daily life. Richard sat with his gaze lowered as I continued. Moving forward, Horizon Marketing will be implementing new policies to ensure truly equitable opportunities for advancement. And we'll be launching a partnership with the Sullivan Foundation to provide paid internships and mentorship for students without family connections or traditional advantages in our industry. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Whether from genuine support or recognition of the new power dynamics was unclear, but the seed had been planted. 6 months later, as I sat in what had once been Richard's office, now mine after his conveniently timed health-related departure, I reviewed the quarterly results with satisfaction. Under my leadership as president, Horizon had not only implemented comprehensive diversity policies but had also increased profitability by 34%. My office remained simply furnished. No status symbols or expensive art. My clothes were still chosen for quality and practicality rather than designer labels. The difference was that now these choices represented authentic values rather than necessary concealment. On my desk sat a small piece of coral in a glass display, a reminder from that pivotal retreat. Beside it was a photo of my father and me standing with the first group of foundation interns who had joined Horizon the previous month. The intercom buzzed and my assistant's voice came through. Your father is on line 1. Something about planning next year's company retreat. I smiled as I picked up the phone. Some things had changed dramatically, but the most important things remained the same. Hi, Dad, I answered. I was just thinking about you.